My name is Raina Carter. I was 13 when my sister's lie shattered the only home I'd ever known. Not in some abstract emotional wound way either. I mean shattered, like the windows shook from thunder as my father told me to get out, his voice louder than the sirens howling outside. I can still see the way he looked at me, like I wasn't his daughter anymore, like I was something dangerous in his house, something to be purged. That night, I walked out into the worst storm our county had seen in a decade, with nothing but a hoodie, waterlogged sneakers, and the weight of knowing no one inside that house wanted me back. But what neither I nor my parents could have known was that someone entirely unexpected, was about to step into the story and change everything. The way my father's hands shook when he finally saw who it was that picked me off the pavement, there was more than shock in his eyes. There was shame, lots of it. But let me take you back, because people don't just throw away their daughters for no reason. Unless you live in a house like mine, where truth had always been the quietest voice in the room. From the outside, we looked like a picture-perfect suburban family. White picket fence, Volvo in the driveway, matching holiday pajamas every Christmas. And if you met my parents at church or in the aisles of the grocery store, you'd think they were the kind of folks who coached youth soccer and handed out Halloween candy with a smile. You might have even admired them once until you saw how they molded their lives around their youngest daughter, Lily, as if she were carved from glass and coated in gold. If she cried, the world stopped. If she failed, someone else took the blame. More often than not, I took the blame, but I got used to it. At least I thought I did. I was a quiet kid, sharp in school, curious about everything from astronomy to classic literature. On paper, I was the kind of child most parents would praise endlessly. I won spelling bees, painted first-place fair entries, even got invited to a pre-college STEM camp when I was just 12. My teachers adored me. My friends' parents would say things like, "Your Raina is just so mature." But inside my own home, I was seen through a different lens, the serious one. The complicated one, the child my mother loved but never understood, the daughter my father expected more from but never really saw, not compared to Lily. Lily was 3 years younger than me, blonde where I was dark-haired, bubbly where I was measured. She had a way of turning every room into her stage. Teachers called her charming, even when her homework mysteriously disappeared or test answers looked suspiciously similar to her neighbors. She had this act down to a science, tears on command, trembling lips, a tiny quiver in her voice when she said things like, "I didn't mean to," or "I just wanted to make people happy." It used to work on just strangers. But somewhere around the age of 10, Lily realized something crucial. It worked even better on our parents. The first time she lied and got me in trouble, I laughed. It was harmless. A missing cookie from the kitchen that Mom assumed I'd eaten. Lily giggled, watching me get scolded, then winked at me like it was a game. I remember asking her later, "Why didn't you tell them the truth?" Her answer should have warned me. She said, "Because they believe me when I cry." That moment lives in my brain like a splinter. Over the next year, things escalated. A broken vase blamed on me. A bike left out in the rain because Raina told me to. Small things, then medium things, then things that mattered. Lily got away with everything. I used to plead with my parents to please just listen to me. I'd explain, show evidence, list facts like a lawyer trying their hardest. But in every courtroom conversation, Lily remained the beloved witness with trembling hands and wide, innocent eyes. And I became the girl with a pattern of misbehavior. My parents, especially my father, clung to the narrative that I was slipping, losing control. "Maybe we should speak to someone," Mom suggested once, setting a brochure for adolescent therapy on the counter when she thought I wasn't looking. Let me pause for a second. If any of this is hitting home for you, even a little, drop a yes in the comments, because I swear I thought I was the only one. When truth becomes taboo in your own house, you start to doubt your own memory, your own voice. But the worst was yet to come, and it happened all because of a boy named Tyler and a single message that never existed. Tyler was a neighbor, 2 grades above me, lanky and smart in that way boys are before they grow into their confidence. We had a few casual conversations, mostly about the universe. I remember one afternoon we sat on his porch talking about dark matter while his dog chased squirrels. I didn't think much of it, But Lily watched us from the upstairs window. She took in every laugh, every eye glint, and a few hours later she knocked on my bedroom door and asked if I liked him. I said he was nice, that's all. I swear on everything I love, that's all I said. The next day, chaos descended. My father came into my room, stone-faced, holding Lily's iPad, demanding to know what I meant by calling Lily a jealous, pathetic brat who doesn't deserve Tyler's attention. I was stunned. I hadn't typed a single word, let alone sent any messages. But there it was, a screenshot, an entire thread from my name, from my account. Words I would never write, not to her, not to anyone. I stammered, explained. Dad, it's fake, she spoofed it. There's software that can... You think I'm a fool? He snapped. You think I don't know what my own daughter sounds like? He didn't wait for an answer. That was the first time he called me manipulative. It wouldn't be the last. By then, Mom was crying. Not for me, but again, over Lily. She says you've been bullying her for months. We thought it was a phase. Raina, is this true? I couldn't breathe. No, it's not. You're taking her word again without proof. In the background, Lily sniffled, buried her head in a pillow, and said nothing. But the moment my mom leaned in and said, "We need to give Lily space to feel safe in this house," something inside me snapped. I shouted. For the first time in my life, I didn't fold. I told them everything from the broken vase to the staged tears to the calculated lies. Every time they'd believed her over me. Every time I'd been the punching bag, the scapegoat, the sacrificial daughter. And my father? He looked at me like I was a stranger trying to destroy his perfect family. That night, I sat on my bed staring at the green swirl on the radar map. A storm was coming. I didn't know just how literal that would become. But the gods must love symbolism because less than 2 hours later, the rain fell so hard it sounded like fists on the roof, and my father was standing in the hallway, jaw set. "I don't want you under this roof tonight," he said. "Not after what you've done." "It's raining," I whispered, "so stay dry in the lies you've made for yourself." I didn't move, so he did. He opened the door himself. The wind howled. Mom stood behind him, arms crossed, eyes glassy. "Go," he said. And this time, I listened. The door slammed behind me with a finality that didn't just feel like rejection. It felt like exile. I stood there, my hoodie already soaked within seconds, rain slicing across my face like tiny knives, trying to decide if this was real or if I finally cracked under the years of my sister's carefully constructed lies. For a moment, all I could do was stand under the porch light blinking through sheets of rain as if even the house itself wasn't quite sure it wanted to illuminate me anymore. The wind whipped around the corners, stealing the breath from my chest, and I realized that my legs had begun moving without consent. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. I just knew that I couldn't be under that roof a second longer. So I walked. My shoes squelched through puddles with every step, the storm crescendoing above me, thunder vibrating in the hollow spaces of my body. Cars passed, but none slowed. I imagined what I must have looked like to them. Some drenched kid in a hoodie alone on a Friday night, the kind of thing people avoid because they don't want to get involved, because maybe, just maybe, they assume I'm a runaway or worse, someone dangerous. That thought hit me hard, how quickly people can assign danger to someone just because they don't understand the pain shaping them. I crossed Maple Street, used the library awning to catch my breath, but that hope shattered too. The lights were off. Closed. I knew the bus station was another 2 miles at least, but it was the only place open all night, and somewhere in me, survival overruled the horror. I walked. My fingers felt like frozen sticks by then. The rain made it hard to tell where the sidewalks ended and the streets began, and more than once I stepped off the edge too early, slipping, barely regaining my balance before a horn blared from nowhere. My phone? Dead. It died about 10 minutes into my walk, even though it had been at 14% when I left. Typical. The universe seemed as done with me as my family was. I remember crossing Park Avenue. That's where things get blurry for the first time. The crosswalk light flickered green. I stepped out. A flash of white light exploded in my periphery, then the sound, screeching tires. A scream. I think it was mine, but maybe not. And in the next breath, I was on the ground, pain blooming in my chest like 1,000 splinters all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My vision swam. Rain filled my ears and eyes, blurred every fragment of my surroundings until I felt a pair of hands on my shoulders. "Don't move," said a voice, soft and low and utterly urgent. Feminine but steady. "Stay awake, okay? I've got you." I blinked up through the storm, saw vague features, dark eyes, sharp cheekbones, a tight bun dripping water. The woman crouched beside me, shielding me from the rain with her own coat, which she'd already stripped off before paramedics arrived. "Stay with me, okay?" she kept saying. And somehow, I did. The hospital was a haze, cold. Sounds layered on top of more sounds. Sirens and beeping monitors. People moving around me, past me, through me. But she stayed. The woman, holding my hand while the doctors talked about concussions and trauma and scans. I think I drifted in and out of consciousness more times than I could count, but she never left. Not until the police showed up to ask what had happened. Not until someone asked, "Does anyone know the girl's name?" And she answered before I could speak. "Raina. Raina Carter. I found her walking alone. In the storm." It wasn't until later, when the world slowed just enough to catch up with reality, that I heard her last name and realized who she was. Dr. Marin James, a professor, the same woman my school had invited 3 months earlier for a guest lecture on youth advocacy and education policy. I'd stayed after class to ask a question, remember? She'd complimented my curiosity, told me not to let anyone dim my light. And now, here she was, having quite literally picked me off the street and carried me through what should have been my last hour. I didn't understand the weight of that miracle until the next night when I woke up groggy, sore, but alive, and saw my father walk into the hospital room flanked by my mother, their eyes wide, their faces pale, their posture stiff with uncertainty. His eyes snapped to the foot of my bed, and at the sight of the woman beside me, her calm, commanding presence in a navy coat soaked from a day's stay by my side, his hand started to shake. Not in anger, in recognition. In guilt. Maybe both. "You!" he said, voice catching like a record scratch. My mother just blinked. I looked between them and Dr. James, suddenly realizing they knew each other, not personally, but by reputation. My father worked in education lobbying at the state level. Dr. James was outspoken against everything he'd ever campaigned for. They'd sparred indirectly for years. He called her a radical idealist in more than one dinner table rant. And now here she was, the woman who'd stayed with his exiled daughter through a night he'd rather forget. "What are you doing here?" he asked her slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what his eyes were telling him. She stood calmly, met his gaze without flinching. "I found your daughter lying in the street, bleeding. I called 911. I didn't leave her side because she told me you threw her out. In the middle of a storm." My mother inhaled sharply. My dad clenched his fists. "That's a very oversimplified version of," she said, and I quote, Dr. James interrupted, her voice suddenly venom-tipped velvet. "My parents don't want me. They said I'm sick." My father glanced down at his shoes. An old habit when he had no argument. My mother opened her mouth, closed it again. Dr. James folded her arms, eyes narrowing. "So tell me, are you here for damage control or for your daughter? Because I promise if you try to spin this as anything less than abandonment, the truth will make its way through every channel faster than you can say reputation." Silence. I was torn between sorcery-level awe and a profound ache in my chest. I watched my father deflate like air rushing from a balloon. His eyes met mine, and for once he wasn't mad. He was something worse, small, diminished. Like he'd looked into the mirror and hated what stared back. He stepped closer, chest hitching. "Raina," he began, voice trembling, "we made a mistake. That night." "Stop," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "This isn't the time." I turned to Dr. James. "Can you stay?" She nodded without hesitation. "As long as you need." That was the moment things changed for good. Not just because they had to, but because I let them. 3 days in the hospital passed in a kind of quiet limbo where time lost shape. And the only things that tethered me to the present were the soft beeping of the machines beside me and the steady presence of Dr. Craw, Marin James, who began to feel less like a stranger and more like a tether to something steady, something safe. She brought books, not flowers. She sat in the visitor's chair reading case studies while I dozed off, and when I woke up mid-panic from a dream where rain turned into fire, she simply adjusted my IV and said softly, "You're not where they left you. You're safe now." I wanted to believe her, but after years of being gaslit into silence, trust wasn't a door I could just fling open. Still, her presence spoke louder than my defenses. My parents returned twice more during that stay, once bringing clothes and awkward apologies, the other to sign something about insurance, but each time they hovered at a distance, as if ashamed to breathe the same air I did. The second visit lasted only 7 minutes. They brought my younger sister Lily with them, who never made eye contact, never said a word, just stood half a step behind my mother like a shadow cast too long. I couldn't look at her without thinking about the fake screenshots and the crocodile tears and how she'd watched me get thrown into a storm without blinking. Dr. James handled their visits like a bodyguard dressed in intellect. She never raised her voice, never flinched, just reminded them quietly with her presence that I wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, for the first time in their lives, they were the ones who had something to fear. On the fifth day, a social worker named Beth came in with her clipboard and her soft cardigan and her voice like warm tea. She didn't pry, didn't judge, just gently asked, "Do you feel safe returning home?" The word home felt like cemetery dirt. I didn't answer. But Dr. James spoke for me, eyes on Beth, steady. She's not ready to go back, and biologically shared walls don't equal safety. I glanced up and in that moment realized something was happening, something real. It wasn't just concern from a good Samaritan anymore. It was intentional, purposeful, protective. "Her name's Marin," I whispered to Beth. "Can I stay with her? Just until I figure things out?" Beth gave a subtle nod. "Actually," Marin said before Beth could reply, "I've already filed the temporary placement paperwork. The system just needs your consent." Before I could even ask why, she leaned in, eyes soft, voice firm. "Because years ago, someone did for me what I'm now doing for you, and that gift doesn't end with one person. It moves forward." So I moved forward. I did not go back to the beige sidings of the house with navy shutters and a "Family is Forever" decal peeling off the front door. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't say goodbye. I left that version of home, like a prisoner making parole. And every step toward Marin's small brick bungalow, a town over, felt heavier with shedding until, finally, I no longer carried the weight of being someone else's scapegoat. Her house smelled like books and cedar. Her couch had worn patches, but was warm the way a grandmother's hug lingers. She gave me the guest room, the one that used to belong to her niece, and told me I could rearrange it however I wanted. No rules, just respect. As I stood in the doorway of that room with freshly laundered sheets, I realized I had never really had space that was mine, not just physically, but emotionally. That night, I slept through an entire storm without waking once, though thunder rolled and crackled until morning. Starting fresh meant more than a new bed or a different roof. It meant enrolling in a new school where no one knew me as that girl with the drama at home, and I could rebuild the blueprint of who I was without anyone trying to rewrite my story in their favor. At Brookwood High, people didn't see me as the second Carter sister or the problem child. They saw a quiet girl who asked smart questions and stayed late in science lab, who always volunteered to lead group projects and clutched a pencil like it was a shield. I started breathing easier. Marin coached me through every meeting with school counselors, every scholarship application, every decision that normally would have sent me spiraling. She never forced conversations about what happened, just dropped breadcrumbs of wisdom like, "Pain doesn't make you weak, denial does." Slowly, I let her in. Told her about how Lily learned to weaponize innocence, how being the older sister meant always having to know better, how achievement was never enough to outweigh her victim act. And every time I stopped because my throat clenched, about to cry, Marin would wait, then say something like, "You didn't imagine it, and you're not broken. You were trained to question yourself by people who didn't deserve your trust." I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until I did. Over the next year, things kept shifting. Marin brought me to conferences, let me audit college lectures, taught me how to think in policy and see systems behind the pain. She called it radical clarity, the ability to name what hurt and the structure that allowed it. Under her mentorship, school felt less like an escape and more like an origin story being drafted. I wanted to study youth law, create spaces for kids like me, change the language used in every therapy brochure my mother ever left out like a silent weapon. And for the first time ever, when I said this out loud, someone didn't roll their eyes or suggest a backup plan. Marin looked at me, smiled slowly, and said, "Of course you will. Your voice was forged in fire. People will listen, and if they don't, they'll feel it." I wish I could say my family reached out meaningfully, but mostly their attempts were drenched in avoidance. My father emailed once, a long, drawn-out apology wrapped in explanations, stress, misunderstanding, miscommunication. He didn't even say Lily's name, not once. My mother sent a birthday card that said, "We hope you're well," without signing it, "Love, just from." I never responded to either. Lily never apologized, not directly. But a mutual friend said she told people at a party that Raina was staying with some activist professor and probably exaggerating everything. I heard she cried at school once when someone asked if she missed her sister, but whether those tears were real or rehearsed, I'll never know or care, because by then my story wasn't about her anymore. I had stopped defining myself as her consequence. I had become the protagonist, not the punching bag. And the best part? I hadn't even reached the climax yet. That would come years later on a stage, with a microphone, in front of hundreds. The moment everything came full circle, and the truth made its way home in a voice clear enough to cut bone. The years passed like chapters I never expected to live through. Each one different, sharper, filled with momentum that felt entirely mine. By 16, I was dual enrolled in college courses, balancing high school with university-level work, and for the first time in my life, no one told me I was too intense, too serious, too much. Maren called it focus. She said I moved like someone who had clarity about what needed to be changed because I'd walked through what most people only studied. I became the person who knew what silence cost, what lies cost, and how dangerous it is when adults protect a story instead of a child. I didn't see my family during those years, not in person. I knew from Facebook photos that Lily had, unsurprisingly, returned to the center of their universe. She was being celebrated for every mediocre accomplishment, like winning the school newspaper's Most Friendly Smile Award and doing charity work that made its way onto Instagram, but not into real impact. Not once did she post or speak about me. It was like I had been surgically removed from our family history, just a photograph erased, a name no longer spoken out loud. But that suited me. I didn't want revenge. I didn't crave guilt or apologies anymore. What I wanted was truth to live louder than the lie. And the truth was, I had built a life far richer, far warmer than the hollow affections they used to ration out like oxygen to a favorite child. When college applications started, Marin sat beside me through every essay draft, reminding me over and over that my pain wasn't a weakness, it was a credential. "Tell the truth," she said one night, sipping lukewarm tea on our front porch. "Not because they deserve to hear it, but because you need to. Someone out there has your story sitting inside them like a secret, and your courage gives them permission to breathe." That line stuck with me. It's the one I wrote on the first page of my college essay, and I got in. Full ride. Policy major with a double minor in sociology and crisis response. Honors track. I moved out with a suitcase and a HUD that smelled like cedar and chamomile and everything I wished mothers came wrapped in. "Don't look back," Marin whispered, "unless you're watching how far you've come." College wasn't easy academically, emotionally, socially, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, every room I walked into didn't echo with the ghosts of the person my sister invented. I built a reputation based on sharing truth, not reacting to lies. I volunteered at shelters, mentored teens, and by sophomore year, I helped draft a grant proposal that funded educational placements for displaced minors. One night after a student panel, a woman in the audience approached me, nervous. Her hands were shaking. "I don't know how to say this," she stammered, "but my daughter was in a similar situation. She's in a group home now. But tonight, hearing you, I think maybe she can have more." We stood there for a second, two humans who understood what the world could do to a girl with no one, and how powerful it is when even one person says, "I see you." That moment cracked something open in me. From then on, everything I did was with that girl in mind. Every presentation, every policy brief, every internship. I was no longer living to prove my family wrong. I was living to prove that truth, once spoken, could echo louder than erasure. Near the end of college, something unexpected happened. I received an invitation to speak at a youth equity conference, one of the largest in the region, not just as a panelist. As the closing keynote, the theme was the power of being unseen, narratives from the margins. They'd selected me based on my work with the Displaced Youth Initiative and a professor's private recommendation letter detailing my story, not just the professional milestones, but the personal fire that fueled them. When I saw the university logo on the letterhead, my stomach clenched. Because guess where the conference was being hosted? Horizon Ridge University, my sister's school. I hadn't seen her in years, hadn't spoken her name aloud in just as long, hadn't needed to. But life, in its sick delight for symmetry, brought me right back into her orbit, not beneath her shadow, but towering above the campus stage, holding a microphone with full command of the very narrative she'd once rewritten behind my back. I didn't say no. I said absolutely. With one condition, I wanted full transparency about the speaker lineup. No approval filter, just truth. Of course, the conference coordinator replied, this is your story. The week leading up to the keynote felt surreal. Maren helped me practice the speech every night. Not just the content, but the tone, the balance between scar tissue and strength. No names, she said again. You're not here to call them out, you're here to call others in. I nodded, because she was right. I didn't want the attention. I wanted the awareness. So I wrote my speech with precision. I wove data into anecdotes, juxtaposed the power of lies against the resilience of young survivors. I included parts that hurt to remember. The storm, the hospital, the months of silence, but I never wavered. I included the line I had whispered back then from the cracked hospital bed, they don't want me, they said I'm sick. I let that line breathe. I let it echo. I let it mean what it needed to mean for the people listening. The day of the event, I stepped onto the Horizon Ridge campus not as someone's forgotten daughter or misunderstood sibling, but as a speaker, a leader, a builder of bridges between policy and people. My badge said, keynote guest. My voice? It didn't shake once. When I walked onto that stage, hundreds of faces in the crowd, some disengaged, some buzzing, some already halfway to tears. I didn't look for Lily, but I felt her. Somewhere in that auditorium, I knew she was there or knew someone who was, knew someone who would rush to text her. Isn't your sister speaking today? But I didn't speak to her. I spoke to the girl who walked through a storm, bleeding and soaked and betrayed, who for a moment thought the rain would swallow her whole. I told her story, yes, but I didn't stop there. Because survival isn't an ending. It's Act 1. And now? Now I was on Chapter 20, and this one was mine. When I stepped up to the podium, the silence in the auditorium was absolute. Not the kind of silence that begs for attention, but the kind that holds its breath and leans in a little closer, sensing that something real is about to be said. I adjusted the height of the microphone slowly, letting the pause stretch just long enough to make people look up from their phones and lock eyes with the person they hadn't yet realized was going to ruin them in the best possible way. When I was 13, I began, my voice steady and clear. I was called a liar, a problem, and something far more damaging, sick. And I believed it. Because when the people who raise you tell you who you are, you don't question it. Not at first. You fold yourself down to fit inside their version of you. That was my opening, and I knew from the way the room stiffened that it had landed. I didn't need theatrics. The story did the work. I told them about the girl who stood on the porch in the middle of a storm, gripping the doorframe not because she wanted to stay, but because she couldn't understand how her own father could look her in the face, call her sick, and then choose silence as she walked into danger. I didn't have to embellish. Trauma doesn't need special effects. The sound of rain, the weight of soaked denim, the ache of betrayal. That's enough. I told them about the car that hit me, not as tragedy bait, but as a turning point. Not because a miracle happened on the asphalt, but because a woman did. A woman named Maren. I looked across the crowd and let them know that safety sometimes wears a stranger's face. That rescue rarely looks like flashing lights and often looks like someone who sees your worth before you can speak it aloud. I saw them react, heads nodding slowly, hands covering mouths, quiet yeses from middle-aged women in the second row who clearly weren't just attending for continuing education credits. I wove in statistics how many kids are pushed from homes based on politics, jealousy, scapegoating, abuse hidden under discipline. I layered the emotion with numbers, not to numb the pain, but to legitimize it. Because for so many of us, stories only become real once someone else confirms they're not anomalies, they're patterns. I could feel the momentum shift about halfway through when I said, the lie wasn't what broke me. It was the agreement around the lie, the way it was protected, the way it was easier for them to let me suffer than to confront the golden child's smile was stained with manipulation. A murmur spread. They felt that one because somewhere in that room were people who had been Lily, people who had protected a Lily, and many more who had been me. I could see it in the faces of the girls in the back row, blinking away something they weren't ready to call grief. I didn't name her, I didn't name my parents, but I named what they did, and I made sure it was clear that pain can grow purpose, that betrayal can birth infrastructure. I held up the programs we built, the youth housing org, the support app for displaced minors, the private fellowship that, for the past 2 years, had placed 32 girls into homes where they weren't just safe, but celebrated. I said, they took their daughter out of a house and gave the world an advocate, a policymaker, a woman who builds not just shelters, but systems. That trade, it may have cost them their family, but for me, it gave me everything. Still, I didn't end there. I closed with the very words Marin had spoken to me in that hospital room when I couldn't even lift my head. Don't let them convince you that you're hard to love just because they never learned how to love someone honest. The audience was silent for a full second longer than expected, as if unsure whether they'd just attended a speech or a sermon, and then the room erupted. Not out of politeness, out of release. Like they needed someone to say what they'd all been trying to name in therapy or group chats or the pit of their stomach for years. I wasn't looking for applause, but in that moment, I felt closure crack open like dawn. After everything, after walking away, after surviving, after building something bigger than any of the damage, they saw me, not just as someone who had been thrown away, but as someone who chose what to pick back up. I stepped down from the stage and didn't look for faces in the crowd. I didn't need to, but out of the corner of my eye, in the far left row, I caught a glimpse of someone I hadn't seen in years. Blonde hair curled too perfectly, shoulders stiff, silence in the middle of standing ovations around her. Lily. She was there, not with our parents, alone. She hadn't clapped. She hadn't cried. Her face was a portrait I'd seen before when I walked out into the storm and she watched from the upstairs window, dry and safe and smiling. Only this time, she wasn't smiling. Our eyes didn't meet, but I caught enough to know she recognized every word said, and more importantly, that she knew the whole room had heard them. I breathed. I walked away, not vindicated, liberated. Because seeing her there didn't fill me with rage or vindictiveness, it filled me with clarity. I no longer needed an apology. She could keep her silence or break it. Either way, it no longer held power. That power had long since transferred to me, and I had used it to build something far more permanent than revenge. I'd used it to build voice. The weeks after the keynote were a strange combination of peace and noise, the kind of peace that comes from finally saying everything that needed saying, and the kind of noise that came from everyone else finally listening. The video went viral faster than I expected. It wasn't polished, just a grainy stream from a student's phone, but somehow that rawness made it more powerful. Someone posted it online under the title, "She was thrown out in a storm. Listen to how she took her story back," and within 48 hours, it had over 500,000 views. My inbox flooded with messages from strangers, teenagers who thanked me for showing them they weren't crazy, middle-aged women who said they remembered the night their own sister lied and they took the fall. Even former teachers who quietly admitted they now recognized the patterns in students they once dismissed. But one message stood out. It wasn't sent through official channels. It came late one night, tucked between social media notifications and a spam offer to buy followers. It was from Lily, not a burner account, not hidden, just her full name, no subject line, no pretense. The message was short. I was there. I didn't know what to say. I still don't. But I heard you. And I remember everything. I stared at it for a long time, my phone glowing soft against the darkness of my bedroom. It didn't feel like an apology. It didn't feel like much at all. But for the first time, it wasn't another lie. It was an admission, a crack in the wall she'd built for over a decade. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I had nothing left to prove. She had her truth now, delivered publicly and powerfully, and what she did next was not my responsibility to manage. I wasn't that girl anymore, the one who used to beg my parents to believe me, who used to ask over and over, "Can't you see what she's doing?" I had no interest in resuming any story where I was the one trying to teach someone basic empathy. Closure, I've learned, is often quieter than expected. It's not always forgiveness or confrontation or even explanation. Sometimes it's a single moment in a storm-soaked past coming full circle in front of a microphone, when the people who doubt you see your truth spoken so powerfully they have no choice but to live with it. A few days after the message, I got a call from my old high school, Lawrence High, the same building where teachers had disciplined me for speaking up and left awards with my name mispronounced because honoring me loudly would have meant admitting they'd ignored me quietly. A new principal had arrived, one with reform on their mind, and she asked if I would be willing to speak at this year's assembly on resilience and change. "We want the students to know that their stories matter," she'd said, "and that survival isn't shameful." It took every part of me not to laugh because the irony was bitter and rich, but I didn't say no. I said, "Yes, I'll speak, but only if you let me say everything." She agreed. And so, 2 weeks later, I walked back into the hallways that once echoed with silence after every betrayal, only this time with my spine straight and my voice steady. I stood on that auditorium stage, same wooden floor that once felt like enemy territory, and looked into the eyes of students who may never know what it cost me to return. But who needed to hear that it was possible? I told them not about blame, but about truth, about how when systems fail you, you don't mold yourself to please them, you build new ones. I left out the names, but made the point crystal clear. And when I left that school, I didn't cry like I thought I might. I smiled. Because every step I took out the front doors felt like reclaiming something I didn't even know I'd left behind. Back in my life, my work with youth advocacy expanded. The grant we'd started grew legs. More students signed up for our housing pipeline. I created workshops, how to spot manipulation in family dynamics, how to ask for help when your helpers are the problem, how to document truth when you're constantly being told your memory is mistaken. Marin helped design the curriculum. Sometimes I'd just sit beside her while we planned lesson outlines and reflect on how surreal it all was, that the quiet girl who walked into her guest room numb and disappearing had become the one leading entire movements with policy and power. "Does it ever feel real to you?" I asked her once, sipping coffee beside a pile of student applications. She looked at me for a full moment, soft pride in her eyes. "It doesn't have to feel real. It just has to feel right." And it did, right in a way that didn't erase the pain, but made it meaningful. Right in a way that said, you didn't deserve what happened, but you are the only one who gets to decide what comes next. Every time I looked at an application from a teen who checked the box marked "No guardian support," I remembered who I was at 13, staring at a storm with nothing but a jacket and a lie hanging heavy in my chest. And every time I signed a new acceptance letter for one of our programs, I felt like I was reaching back through time into that rain, offering that girl an umbrella a hand, a future she hadn't dared to imagine yet. One night, a panel I'd joined was being live streamed by a major organization. The topic, reconstructing narratives after relational trauma. During the Q&A, someone asked, "What would you say to the people who hurt you if they were listening right now?" Everyone on stage got quiet, waiting to see if I would answer. I looked at the moderator, then at the camera, and I said, calm and simple, "I'd say thank you for showing me exactly what love should never feel like. From the moment you let the rain swallow me, I learned how to swim through storms alone, and I became unstoppable." That clip, of course, made its rounds, and I'm sure it found its way into the ears of people I no longer speak to. But I didn't say it for them. I said it for every person watching who hadn't yet made it to the other side. Because that's what empowerment is. It's not just surviving. It's holding up the survival like a lighthouse and saying, "You're not the only one. Keep going." In the end, I didn't need my family back. I didn't need Lily to redeem herself. I didn't need my father's trembling hands or my mother's silence to be replaced with hugs. I just needed to know that I wasn't what they called me. I wasn't the troublemaker. I wasn't the liar. I wasn't the sick daughter. I was Raina. and I was finally home inside a life I chose, built, and claimed without anyone's permission but my own. The day I walked past my old house again was quiet, not dramatic like the storm all those years ago, not laced with confrontation or grand revelations. It was just quiet. Early fall, leaves blowing lazily down the sidewalks, the air filled with the kind of chill that isn't quite winter but reminds you it's coming. I didn't intend to go there. I'd been speaking at a youth center 2 towns over and took the long way back, trying to clear my head, when I realized my route curved just close enough to Pinehurst Lane. I hadn't seen that house in nearly a decade. But when it came into view, the ache I expected didn't come. No anger, no anxiety, just careful curiosity, like opening a photo album you haven't touched in years and finding a version of yourself preserved there, foreign, fragile, but still breathing inside the image. The shutters were faded now. The porch light was still crooked, something that used to drive my mom crazy. There were children's bikes on the lawn, but not Lily's old pink one. A different family lived there now. I watched from across the street, invisible. No one looked out the window. No one seemed to sense my history in the pavement. I didn't want to go up. I didn't want to knock. I didn't want to explain. I just stood there, coat wrapped tight, the wind catching strands of hair and tugging them to the side, thinking about what had happened on that porch. The door that had closed, not just on a rainy night, but on a version of me they never wanted to understand. And I realized now the pain wasn't just the rejection. The worst part was how normal it had felt by then, like I half expected it. Like it wasn't even shocking that my parents believed my sister's tears over my truth. I waited, I think, for the grief to rise up, but it didn't. It had already been processed, layer by layer, season by season, conversation by conversation with therapists, with social workers, with Marin, with myself. All that was left here was a hollow shape where a foundation should have been. I stood there for 8 minutes and then kept walking, not with dramatically squared shoulders or slow-motion movie confidence, just walking. That's the thing people don't tell you about healing. It's not a shout. It's a gentle, consistent refusal to let old narratives decide your future. Years passed. The work continued. I founded my own nonprofit, the Echo Network, named after the idea that our stories don't end. They reverberate through policies, through conversations, through the way other kids learn to name what happened to them without shame. We worked with thousands across the state building training for school counselors, setting up emergency contacts for minors who had nowhere else to go, even transforming foster system intake interviews to center dignity at the core. For a girl once called too much, I had become incredibly just enough in all the right rooms. Marin retired eventually, but not before we co-authored a book together, part memoir, part manual. From the Storm to the Standpoint, it was called, and it became a quietly powerful tool for reform-minded educators and trauma-informed advocates. She gave me the final draft with a note inside, "This is and always has been yours." But beneath all the work, the visibility, the applause, I guarded a truth carefully. Some wounds never fully close. They just stop bleeding. Once, on a random weekday, I received a plain white envelope in the mail. No return address. Just my name and handwriting I recognized instantly. Inside was a photo, the last one ever taken of me inside the Carter house. Me and Lily on the couch. I was smiling politely. She was draped across the cushions like a princess. On the back, in the same handwriting, were 4 words, "I miss us too." No signature, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time, amazed, confused, almost angry at how those 4 words could reopen 10 years of memory like an attic door. But I didn't cry. I didn't rip the photo up. I slipped it into a drawer under papers, not because I wanted to forget it, but because I wanted to control how often I saw it. Healing, I've learned, is not deletion. It's contextualization. Giving something a place where it can no longer control the temperature of your whole day. Shortly after, I was invited to speak at a global conference on youth transformation policy. I stood alongside activists from war zones, trauma therapists, juvenile advocates. I told my story again, but this time not about what happened in the storm, but about what happened afterward. How being believed once by one person shifted the entire orbit of my life. "We don't heal alone," I said that day. "We heal beside someone willing to sit in the truth with us, someone willing to stay." Afterward, an attendee approached me in the lobby, older, gray at the temples, press suit. He said he'd been a superintendent for 25 years and had never cried like that in a professional setting. I used to think we just had troubled kids, he admitted. Now I know sometimes we just failed them before they had a chance. I shook his hand and thanked him. But on the inside, a quiet flame burned, a hope ignited not by what was said, but by what was finally understood. I don't wake up every day thinking about my sister. I don't flinch anymore when it rains. But sometimes, just before big speeches or on quieter nights when the house hums with the kind of stillness that invites old shadows, I remember the girl standing on the porch, soaked and unseen. And every time I do, I silently say to her, "You made it. You're safe now." And they were wrong about everything. The night I finally told Marin everything, truly everything, wasn't planned. We were sitting on her porch again, years after she'd first brought me home from that hospital and given me the room with the yellow curtains and the secondhand bookshelf. The air was still, just enough wind to rustle the ivy growing along the railing, and the sky held that dusky, purplish hue that only appears when the sun is too tired to shine but not quite ready to surrender. I don't know what triggered it. Maybe it was the way Marin had asked how I'd been sleeping, or the way she refilled my tea without me asking, the way she always used her hands like a question soft open, never grabbing at pieces of me I wasn't ready to give. I looked at her, this woman who had once been a stranger and had since become my everything. A lighthouse, a landing, a mother not by blood but by choice. And I whispered, "I used to dream that I was the lie." She turned toward me, didn't answer, just let the silence widen until I was ready. "Not just that I was blamed for Lily's lies," I continued slowly, "but that I was somehow the invention, like maybe I didn't really exist, just a shadow made up to carry all the weight no one else wanted to feel." My voice caught in my chest like string, because when no one believes you long enough, you start wondering if you imagined the truth. It was the closest I'd ever come to admitting how deep it had gone, not just the betrayal, but the erasure. How I stopped trusting my own voice, how I'd replayed every moment at night, trying to find the error in my memory, the glitch in the reel that would finally justify why I was always the one on the outside. And to say that to Marin, to give her that last piece of rusted metal in my chest and trust she wouldn't flinch when it cut, was terrifying. But she didn't pull away. She leaned in, her hand resting gently on my shoulder, and said with fierce softness, "Of course you believe that, because they needed you to. That's how the whole system worked. But Raina, you're the realest thing I know, and every word out of your mouth has been forged from fire. That's not a lie, that's a legacy." I cried then. Not the neat narrative kind of crying they show in movies, but the ugly, face and hands kind that feels like both release and reckoning. And through it all, Marin just sat there, not trying to fix me, not trying to patch or explain, just letting me be human. That was the moment I knew, truly knew, that healing doesn't come from being heard once. It comes from being heard over and over consistently until you no longer need to shout your truth into the void, hoping anyone, will send an echo back. It gave me a different kind of courage, not rage-fueled, not revenge-inspired, just clarity. And with that clarity came a decision. I sat down that following week and opened a blank document, a letter to my sister, never meant to be sent. I didn't write it for validation. I didn't write it expecting remorse. I wrote it to give language to the years I'd spent building my life in the wreckage of hers. I wrote about the pajamas soaked through with rain, the way my fingers had gone numb as I waited for the door to creak back open, the way her silence had sounded like applause the night I was pushed out. I wrote about the bruise she faked, the screenshot she fabricated, the moment at school when I pleaded with her behind the lockers, not even to admit the truth, just to help stop the damage, and how she looked right past me, untouched. I wrote every memory, every lie, every stone stacked on my back until my voice cracked under the weight. And then I wrote, "I don't hate you." Not because I didn't have good reason to, but because hatred is a tether, and I was done being attached to anything that made me feel small. I ended it with, "I don't need your apology. You were the lie, but I became the truth. And the truth is, I survived you. I survived them. I survived everything. And now I live louder than any of it." I closed the file and never looked at it again. But it helped. It helped like extracting a splinter sharp in the moment but necessary to heal. Months passed. Lily's messages slowed, then stopped. My parents sent a Christmas card one year, signed with just their names, no greeting, no warmth, just proof of life, and even that I tucked into a box without reaction. I was done translating their silence into a hierarchy of value. People either show up or they don't. You either choose someone daily or you lose the right to expect doorways into their reborn lives. And I had been reborn. Not as a shell of who I was before, but as something fuller, someone who built roots in truth and bloomed in spite of shadow. My work continued. My story, once an open wound, became architecture holding up panel discussions, youth housing councils, even government proposals for revamped regulation. I got used to seeing my name on letterheads, used to walking into rooms and not waiting to be given permission to matter. I mentored girls who'd only ever heard their reflections called dramatic or unstable or liars, and I whispered what Marin once said to me, "You're not the problem, you survived the problem." And watching their eyes widen with that realization, it never stopped humbling me. Because my survival didn't just save me, it saved countless others too. And there's no lie in the world strong enough to erase that. Not everything wrapped up perfectly, and no part of me ever expected it to. Healing isn't an upward slope. It's a maze with dead ends and missteps and moments when the light breaks through just enough to remind you you're still moving. I had setbacks, days I couldn't sleep, nights when I woke up mid-panic because some part of my brain had set off an old alarm. There were moments I'd hear a teenage girl's voice with the same whine in the tone that Lily used when she was about to lay down another false accusation, and my throat would tighten on instinct. But they didn't define me. I journaled. I meditated even when my mind ran in circles. I walked and cooked and made playlists that sounded like survival. I learned when to shut off social media and when to lean into ideation. I forgave myself for not knowing how to tell the difference between love and control when I was too young to have a map. And above everything else, I made peace with the idea that justice and closure are not the same thing. Justice is public. Closure is private. Justice is someone being held accountable. Closure is you choosing to no longer carry someone else's guilt like it's a family heirloom. There was one more letter. It came a year after the last message from Lily, this time in a proper envelope. Real return address, familiar handwriting with the same dramatic loops she'd perfected at 13. Inside, 4 sheets of lined notebook paper, the kind she used for diary entries. This time, it was written like one. I lied, it said. About everything. Not because I hated you, at least not at first, but because you were so good at everything and I didn't know how to keep up. I'd mess up and you'd get a ribbon, I'd cry and you'd get quiet. And the house would always twist itself to accommodate my pain. But I watched the way your light dimmed when you realized love depended on how much space you didn't take up. I saw you start folding. I saw you shrink. And I kept going anyway. I couldn't breathe at first. I set the pages down, walked out of the room, made tea I didn't drink. When I came back, the letter was still there, unapologetic and brutal. "I don't know what to say that could fix it," she wrote. "I don't even know if I think I deserve forgiveness. But I needed you to know that I remember. I remember the storm. I remember the bruise I faked. I remember how scared you looked. I remember crying just enough, not because I was afraid, but because I knew it would make them send you away. You didn't deserve it. You never did. I made them believe I was the victim. And maybe now, I finally understand what I did to you." There were more lines, small details she somehow remembered that I had buried. A cold plate of pasta on the night forecast called for rain, the sound of my sneakers squeaking as I walked out, the way Mom turned her face, the way Dad didn't. I thought if I could undo it later in my mind, it wouldn't mean I'd done it at all, the final paragraph read. But it happened. And I know you've built a life you don't want me in. I'm not asking for that. Just know I'm working every day to be someone I wouldn't have been afraid of if I were you. That line, "someone I wouldn't have been afraid of," shook something loose in me. Not because it redeemed anything, but because it was the first time I truly felt she'd let herself sit in the full weight of what she'd done. Still, I didn't respond. Maybe I would one day, but I wasn't ready. And silence didn't mean hatred anymore. It meant boundaries. It meant I got to decide the terms of my peace without being guilted into reopening wounds that had just begun to scar over. I went back to work teaching another fellowship class. One of the girls, 15, soft-voiced but lightning smart, stayed after to ask if I believed things really got better. "What if no one ever believes me?" she whispered. My answer came without hesitation. You only need one person to believe you, and if that person is you, that's already enough to start healing. I saw her eyes water, and I offered no cliches, no sugar, just space. And later that evening, I lit a candle and pressed my forehead to the window pane, staring out at the quiet rain. Not thunder, not rage, just a soft drizzle, the kind that makes everything smell like fresh turning pages. I closed my eyes, remembering the girl I used to be, watching her become someone this strong, and I smiled. A few months later, I was giving a talk at a regional youth justice summit when someone in the audience stood up at the end for the Q&A and asked me a question I hadn't been asked in years, not by strangers, not in public. "Do you think your sister ever really loved you?" The whole room went still. You could almost feel the collective breath pause, unsure whether the moment had crossed a line. But I didn't wither. I didn't tense or shut down like I might have years ago. I looked at the young man squarely, saw the vulnerable fracture in his voice, knew this question wasn't just his curiosity, it was his story, tangled in mine. Maybe he had a sibling like Lily. Maybe he was Lily. Or maybe he was me, aching for an understanding that never arrived. So I said, "I think Lily loved the idea of me, the big sister who didn't compete, the one she could cry to when it was convenient but push away when attention ran thin. I think she loved having someone to blame when she couldn't carry the weight of her own guilt. But did she love me? The truth-telling, mirror-holding version of me? I don't know. And the thing is, I don't need to anymore." That response didn't earn applause. It didn't need to. It just settled into the air like something quietly right. Afterward, the man came up to me backstage. He looked barely 19, but his eyes had seen much older wars. He said, "I think my sister did everything yours did, maybe worse." And when I tell people, they just say, "You're supposed to protect each other." I nodded gently. That's exactly what they tell us, even when we're the ones needing protection. He swallowed, nodded like he'd been waiting years to hear someone else admit the imbalance. Then he said something that still echoes in my mind. "I didn't know surviving made me brave until I heard you speak." I smiled, touched his shoulder lightly, and replied, "It does. It always has." That evening, I walked back to my hotel alone. The city buzzed around me. Taxis rushing, neon lights humming, storefronts lighting up the streets in fractured rainbows. But none of it distracted me from how grounded I felt. Years ago, a walk alone at night would have felt threatening. But now, my mind was not filled with fear. It was full of impact, full of lives I was being allowed to touch because I took my own back. When I reached the hotel, Marin had just called. I picked up, breathless. She was home in her garden, mint tea in one hand, pruning shears in the other. "You spoke your truth again," she said, no question in it. "I did," I replied. "Was it enough?" I looked at my reflection in the window, a woman now, someone sculpted from ash and refusal, not unbroken, but reforged. "Yes," I whispered, "and every time I tell it, it gets lighter." That night, I slept with the windows open, the sound of the rain like applause in reverse, a reminder that storms didn't scare me anymore. They used to be symbols of abandonment. Now they were just weather. The pendulum had swung. The narrative belonged to me. And more than anything, I was no longer waiting for closure to come from the people who broke me. I had written my closure one speech, one program, one moment of self-trust at a time. I had pulled it out of cold nights and quiet mornings and long walks where I built peace detail by detail. And though forgiveness still felt complicated, boundaries didn't. I had become fluent in the language of self-protection. I had grown roots where they told me I'd rot. And every step forward was proof that a girl left in the rain could become a woman who soaked the world in truth. The next chapter of my life felt less like a climax and more like an unfolding, a steady weaving of meaning into moments that once felt disconnected. Like finally seeing the pattern in a patchwork quilt you didn't realize you'd been stitching all along. The advocacy work deepened, but it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building, not in opposition to what had been taken from me, but in alignment with what I truly believed I deserved. I bought a home. Not a huge one, not a shiny, perfect place, but one with deep wooden floors and a cozy kitchen and a backyard with a single overgrown tree I refused to cut down. I wanted to watch it grow bigger than me. I filled the home with books and warm light and windows that stayed unlocked. The first night I slept there alone, I sat in the living room and whispered, "You're safe," out loud because I wanted my nervous system to hear it from me directly. And I wasn't saying it to 13-year-old Raina anymore. I was saying it to myself, adult me. The one who still sometimes panicked when an unknown number called, the one who still had muscle memory of silence, swallowing screams. The one who had fought to be free not just from her past, but from the version of herself shaped by it. Maren visited often. She brought homemade tea blends and fresh herbs and books she thought I'd love, and sometimes nothing at all but her presence, which after all these years still felt like the safest place on earth. Sometimes we didn't talk about the past. We sat in the garden and listened to wind chimes and let the present be enough. One evening, we were watching the sunset when I asked her, "Why did you stop that night?" "Why me?" She didn't answer right away, just sipped her tea, then finally said, "Because you looked like someone who knew how to disappear, and I'd known that feeling once. I couldn't let you keep walking toward a world that didn't know how to see you." That answer undid me in a way nothing else could. I had spent so long thinking I was forgettable, invisible, inconvenient, but in that moment I understood that someone's entire life could change because another person decided to stop and see. That choice saved mine. Years passed gently. My name appeared in more places, op-eds, grant proposals, educational policies, but never in the way a brand overlays a life. I stayed close to the work, the hands-on, soul-heavy, deeply human work. I made time for the kids, the quiet ones like me who didn't speak much in sessions but lingered after. Eyes full of hope and hunger and quiet terror that their truth wouldn't land in the world the way it landed in their hearts. I saw them. I made sure they felt it. One girl, Kayla, reminded me so much of myself it hurt. She stood in the doorway of my office one afternoon holding an envelope she'd clearly folded and unfolded 100 times. It was her college acceptance letter. I expected her to beam. Instead, she started crying. My mom told me I only got in out of pity. She said people like me don't survive college. I had to breathe before responding. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what it felt like to hear poison said so gently it sounded like concern. I stood, pulled the acceptance letter from her hands, and read it aloud like it was the most sacred proclamation in the world. Then I met her eyes and said, "Your ticket out was never permission from her. It was the decision you already made to be more than what she believed about you. She doesn't define you. She never did." Kayla sobbed like something inside her had finally broken open, but not in despair, in relief. That night, I lit a candle in my kitchen, sat beside the window, and wrote in my journal, "We don't just escape, we rewire, we unlearn, we rebuild." Somewhere deep inside, I knew there would always be moments. Quiet knocks from old pain, ghost memories that tap on glass when it rains too hard or when the house goes still at 3 a.m. But I also knew I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of my past, not of my parents, not of Lily, not even of the girl I used to be. Because I no longer saw her as a cautionary tale, I saw her as proof. Proof that voice can survive silence, that storms can push you into your own becoming, that being thrown out isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. It happened quietly. The final moment I realized I no longer lived in reaction to them. My parents, my sister, that house, that storm, but in complete ownership of myself. I was sitting at a roundtable discussion for a new state education initiative when someone across from me, a policymaker I used to fear because of his reputation for dismissing lived experience as emotion-driven noise, leaned in and said, "I used to think stories like yours were anomalies, but I'm seeing now we've designed systems to ignore them until it's too late." And I didn't blink. I didn't hesitate. I simply replied, "We don't need acknowledgement after the fact. We need transformation during the damage." His eyes dropped to his tablet like my words were too direct, too personal, and I let them be, because that was who I had become, someone who didn't soften the truth to make room for people who once refused to hear it. I drove home that night through light rain, not heavy, not symbolic, just weather. And I smiled at the way it no longer carried a weight, no longer felt poetic or like a reminder of anything except the present moment. As I pulled into my driveway, Marin called. "You sounded like fire," she said simply. I laughed. I wasn't trying to. "Exactly," she replied. That night, I pulled out the old journal I'd kept through all the years of rebuilding, the one I'd only ever written in when I needed to ground myself. And I flipped through the pages like I was rewalking the path that had carried me here. The first entries were all jagged pain, scribbled questions, fear dressed up as bravado. Then came entries about finding breath again, about safety, about stepping onto a stage without shaking. Halfway through were paragraphs in which I began to love myself, not in the shallow Instagram quote way, but in the stubborn ritual of choosing myself again and again when no one had taught me how. The final entry I wrote that night, pen smooth, posture calm, was just one sentence. "I am no longer the girl they threw away. I am the woman who walked back, looked where she fell, and kept walking forward anyway." And it was enough, more than enough. A month later, I launched a program under the Echo Network dedicated specifically to sibling trauma, not just the overt fighting people expect, but the gaslighting, the favoritism, the weaponized narratives that parents often condone without ever realizing how deep they sink. We offered group therapy, narrative writing classes, and a confidential helpline for teens who needed the kind of middle-of-the-night campus visits I never got until it was almost too late. The demand overwhelmed us. There were thousands, girls, boys, non-binary youth, who had all been cast aside in favor of the one who needed more, sacrificed on the altar of family image. One message I got from a 17-year-old read, "I didn't even know what happened to me had a name until today." I cried reading that, not because it surprised me, but because it proved the silence had broken. We had cracked open something unspoken and showed it sunlight. A few weeks later, I stood before the very Board of Education where my father had once worked, now as a guest speaker. I watched middle-aged career officials sit up straighter as I walked to the podium. They were expecting another consultant. They got me. "My name is Raina Carter," I began, "and I'm here today not as your statistic or your exception. I'm here as your reckoning. Because if the girl I used to be had been heard, half the systems you're trying to fix wouldn't be broken today." Dead silence. I continued. "Families protect symmetry, systems protect cycles. But the truth shatters both. I'm here to make sure we build something better with the broken pieces." When I finished the presentation, a board member asked, "What gives you hope after everything you've endured?" And I smiled, not guarded, not performative, just truth-born. Because every time I speak, I said, another child hears that they're not crazy for feeling what they feel. Because every time I speak, someone like me takes one step closer to healing just by letting the truth have volume. And in that echo, I found peace, not because they gave it to me, not because they finally understood, but because it was always mine to name. The invitation came quietly, buried in a stack of mail I almost threw away, an envelope without a sender, addressed in neat, measured handwriting. My mother's. Inside was a card, heavy stock, ivory paper, embossed lettering. "Join us in celebrating Lily Carter's master's degree in communications. Saturday, 3 p.m., Crestwood Hall." No note, no message, just a date and time and RSVP link typed at the bottom as if it were any other invitation to any other ordinary event. I stared at it for a long while, my fingers tracing the gold foil her name was printed in, like maybe if I kept touching it I'd feel something. Anger, grief, betrayal, hope. But there was only this muted stillness inside of me, like someone had yelled into an abandoned room and finally gone quiet when they realized no echo was coming back. I didn't answer the invitation. I didn't call. I didn't rage post online. I just folded it once and slipped it into the same drawer where the last note from Lily sat, wordless artifacts from a life I had outgrown. A few days later, I found myself walking past Crestwood Hall, not to go in, just to see it. It was decorated in white and gold streamers. Cars pulled up every few minutes, carrying smiling people with armfuls of flowers and cards and wrapped boxes. I stood by the old oak tree across the street for a few minutes and watched them arrive, watched them celebrate, watched my parents reappear among the crowd, giddy and proud, posing for pictures like they hadn't once erased a daughter to preserve the shine of another. I saw a photographer gesture for a family shot, and I saw my mother hesitate, glance around, maybe just for a second, but that second told me everything. My absence wasn't haunting them, it was lingering, like an itch they couldn't reach. I turned and walked away before they could see me, before I could see her, before I had to watch the familiar performance of perfection play out again on a stage they always reserved for her. That night, Marin made soup and set 2 bowls on the table. She didn't ask where I'd been, she didn't need to. She looked at me the way she always had, with openness, never pressure, and all she said was, "You're here!" And that was enough. We ate in silence, the kind filled with understanding, not absence. And later that night, curled on the couch under a soft old blanket, I whispered, "It doesn't hurt like it used to." Marin nodded. "That's not because they changed, it's because you did." I smiled, eyes damp with something that felt like release. She got everything she ever wanted. Marin leaned her head back against the cushions. "And you got everything you needed. And isn't that the difference? That needs nourish us while wants leave us starving the second applause fades. I'd stopped craving their pride, their apology, their recognition. My life wasn't a protest anymore. It was a proposal. To build, not react. To raise, not retaliate." That same week, the Echo Network helped its 100th participant secure permanent housing with full tuition coverage and mental health access. We threw a private celebration at our center. The room was small, crowded with joy. One of our earliest graduates gave a short speech. She said, "I used to wonder if I mattered. I know I do now. Because someone like Raina once stood in front of strangers and said my story deserves space." That made me believe I could live instead of just survive. I held it together until the lights dimmed and the rooms emptied. And then I stood alone with my hands pressed to my face, not crying from grief, not even catharsis, just the overwhelming reality that I hadn't just made it out. I had made it worth something. And for the rest of the night, I let that truth hold me the way I once wished someone had. Not tightly, not possessively, but respectfully, gently, like belief, like love. Like knowing I wouldn't trade my life, even with its storms, for anything easier or quieter or more easily understood. I had walked through fire, yes, but I had come away burning with light. Years later, I stood on another stage, not for a keynote, not for a summit, not for policy, but for me. A TEDx event had invited me on the strength of my work, my advocacy, and my story. But this time, I wasn't telling it to prove anything. I wasn't trying to reclaim the floor from someone else's version of me. I had already done that. This was different. The stage lights were a soft halo. The audience, quiet but eager. And as I stepped up to the red circle, clutching the clicker in one hand and the edge of the truth in the other, I breathed in without shaking. "What do you do?" I began slowly, letting each word settle, "when the people who raised you are the ones who taught you to erase yourself?" The silence rippled, palpable. Do you disappear quietly to preserve their comfort? Or do you resurrect the version of yourself that existed before they wrote lies into your bones? I paused, then smiled. I chose resurrection. I told my story, yes, but this time with space around it. Around the pain, around the pivotal moments, around that storm. I didn't relive it, I reframed it. I shared how that single night at age 13 became a compass, not a wound. How the family that exiled me became the shadow that taught me how to find light. And mostly how someone stopping for me quite literally changed the entire trajectory of hundreds of lives down the line. Because one voice heard echoes so many never believed they had the right to speak. Near the end of my talk, I said, "You are not the storm that hit you. You are not the house that kicked you out. You are not the blame you were handed like inheritance. You are who you became when you walked forward anyway." I left the stage to a standing ovation, but what mattered most wasn't the applause. It was the young girl backstage, maybe 16, eyes glassy, who whispered, My sister did it too, and I thought I was the only one. I knelt by her, looked her straight in the eyes, and said, "You're not. You never were. They just made you believe you had to suffer alone." In that moment, I wasn't just a speaker or a leader, I was a mirror, a map, a flicker of what could happen when silence breaks, when isolation is cracked open by one surviving voice. I never saw Lily again, not in person, not on purpose. Over the years, she sent small updates through mutual friends or the occasional forwarded photo without context. I never responded. I didn't need to. My not replying wasn't bitterness, it was boundary. It was self-protection turned into self-worth. The last thing I heard about her was that she'd begun working in PR. Fitting, I thought, still curating narratives, but this time I wasn't one of them. We lived in the same world, but we walked entirely different paths now. Mine was paved with purpose. Hers? I didn't know, and that was okay. I sometimes wonder how my parents explain me now, if they do at all. If I'm the estranged one, or the misunderstood genius, or just omitted. I imagine they glaze over that chapter in their lives at dinner parties the same way they did when I most needed their honesty. But then I remember, I don't live in their stories anymore. I authored my own. My family became something I chose. Marin, Kayla, the dozens of youth who came through our programs, the boardroom allies who now write policies rooted in dignity, the women who message me to say, "Your words were the first thing that made me feel seen." This is what I built, not as rebuttal, not as retaliation, but as revolution, not with anger, with clarity, with boundless strategic love. Because the greatest revenge isn't ruin, it's reinvention. It's peace that doesn't require permission. And it's purpose that grows from the very place they believed nothing could survive. And so, to anyone left standing in a metaphorical storm with soaked shoes and a voice too tired to scream, I say this: keep walking. Whether or not they open the door, whether or not they ever say sorry, whether or not they even remember what they did to you, keep walking. Because one day you'll build a home inside yourself so steadfast, even the wind will learn not to mess with it. One day you'll tell your story not from the wound, but from the wisdom. One day, the word family will not make you flinch. And one day, you'll stand by a window in a quiet house, lightning outside, tea in your hand, and you'll smile. Not because it never hurt, but because it no longer controls you. You'll see your reflection whole and rooted, and you'll remember everything. And still, you'll choose joy. That's what I did. That's what I do. I am not the girl who was left in the storm anymore. I am the woman who turned that storm into a generation of shelters, and I never stopped walking.